to the Hurting Humanity channel. This right here is a blueprint on how you destabilize a country. If you didn't see my video earlier, I talked about how Cuba is under a full-on blackout. The entire electrical grid in the country of Cuba is off. I'm not talking about a county in Florida or small regions of it. An entire country has lost electricity, and this is how you destabilize a country. This is how you turn a country into a humanitarian crisis, because now, conveniently, while the grid is off in Cuba, they are dealing with earthquakes and hurricanes. Tropical storm/Hurricane Oscar has conveniently also made its way to Cuba. But for those of you that don't know, this is a little look at the nationwide blackout across Cuba and how people are chanting, "We want electricity." Keep in mind what I talked about, how you would get civilians to consent, how you would get civilians to give in to government overreach by doing things like this, by shutting off power grids. People will beg the government for electricity because they become so dependent on electricity. Zero civilians know how to make their own electricity in those farms. Zero civilians know how to farm or find drinkable water or get drinkable water. So, of course, people will become dependent on the government. So, say the government says, "Hey, you want electricity back on? Hey, you want to that's fine. Because we're going to need to have nano inside of it all at some point. This entire thing to work out. This is how you start bringing a country to its knees. And this is the blueprint. When they're using around the earth, they're going to use the electrical grid to gain more control over something like power. So, to bring about a new power grid, right? This is how you get AI governance. This is how you get people dependent on green energy by doing things like this. Tonight, Cuba is a country in crisis. At least 10 million across the population without power for the second time in 24 hours after one of the island's major power plants failed on Friday. The blackout putting angry residents closer to the brink of catastrophe and repression already growing shortages of clean water, fuel, and food. Officers no one can stand this, says a visibly frustrated resident. Pushing officials blaming the problem on aging, crumbling infrastructure, already the source of regular rolling blackouts across the island, and on shortage of fuel reports. Outrage flying on the streets. We want electricity. The emergency shutdown in the last attempt to conserve energy was left. This is a While Patrick discovered the experience at the University of Pennsylvania, today is so in addition to that, in addition to the power, people out there enough for the small another hurricane, which they said turned into a tropical storm, which turned another bizarre weather pattern, which made a direct turn right from the Bahamas into Cuba. And I want to play this news report for you, because I want you to hear this term that's used about hurricane hunters, right? This is more program. We've seen this with movies like Twister, right? When people hunt tornadoes. Oh, what do they do? They're driving through the tornadoes, they get those crystal balls over the tornado. So they can study tornadoes when they're using mind control like this to convince the sheeple out there that the government and government military agencies have hurricane hunters. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a government agency, flies planes into these hurricanes so that they can gather their data on the weather. But the reality of the matter is, this is exactly how they weaponize storms and steer them. But listen to this kind of newscaster. Into these hurricanes so that they can gather data on the weather. But the reality of the matter is, this is exactly how they weaponize storms and steer them. But listen to this kind of newscaster talk about how hurricane hunters went directly into the middle of the hurricane.
Let's talk about the tropics. Oscar is still a hurricane. It rapidly strengthened into one yesterday, and we only found that out because hurricane hunters flew a plane through the middle of this yesterday. It is a very tiny, compact system, and it remains a hurricane as it's drifting from the southeastern Bahamas, but it likely will impact eastern Cuba with some hurricane conditions over that small area. A little bit later on today, hurricane hunters have been flying through this, and they're finding the pressure slightly lower, so it may be strengthening just a little bit, and it still has a few hours to do so, but I don't expect much, making that turn and eventually affecting the southeast Bahamas again. Tuesday into Wednesday, and we only found that out because hurricane hunters flew a plane through the middle of this yesterday. Hurricane hunters have been flying through this.
So here we have hurricane hunters. Are we supposed to believe this is just a group of courageous people that really want data on storms, so they fly directly into storms like complete lunatics? Because if you heard there was a hurricane and you were driving into it, wouldn't you say, that's insane? Kind of like what we hear with all these
ships during these hurricanes that continue to travel out at sea. Because they tell everyone out there, well, we're not going to go near the pattern of the storm. We're going to go away from the storm. But they're actually using those cruise ships as another way to use their antennas on the cruise ships to modify and manipulate the weather. So you heard him say flat out in the open about hurricane hunters. And if people don't know about Project Cyrus, you've probably seen my videos where I've talked about all of these different patents that the government has when it comes to weather modification. But specifically Project Cyrus, for anyone out there doesn't know, you can just do a basic search if you want. Because I know that the sheeple out there, if you give them information, they need it from Google itself, the government themselves, for them to actually believe it. If you say it's from this website or that website, they refuse to believe it. So they can actually do this themselves. Project Cyrus was a weather modification project that was the first to attempt to seed a hurricane with dry ice in 1947. The project was a collaboration between the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force and General Electric Corporation. You know, GE, General Electric. You might say to yourself, well, why would General Electric work with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force? Well, because the corporation itself is the government. So the project, which was initiated in 1947, it is 2024 going on 2025. Okay? It was initiated in 1947 to study cloud particles and modifications, right? That's what they... October 13th, 1947, two B-17s and a B-29 dropped nearly 180 pounds of dry ice into the clouds of Hurricane Casey. The crew reported that the cloud deck was modified. However, the hurricane changed direction and made landfall in Savannah, Georgia, causing local destruction. The project was canceled and seeding research was set back to more than a decade. Now, of course, we know that the projects aren't canceled. This is when people actually figure out what's going on with the government every time they say, well, we ceased operations, right? Just like they told us they stopped using HAARP. Just like they told us they stopped using MK Ultra when civilians realized the government was performing experiments on unparticipating civilians through mind control operations. So they don't ever turn these things off. They just tell you that they stopped doing it, right? But that's enough for the sheeple to believe, to say, oh, well, see, they said they stopped doing it, right? So the public back then blamed the seeding and lawsuits were threatened. However, evidence showed that the storm had already begun to turn when seeding began, and a similar path had been taken by a system in 1906. And of course, that's just their misinformation, the aftermath of what happened. But people actually saw the bizarre weather patterns like people are seeing now and called the government out for it. The difference is that the government has more control for the information flow now than they did back then, because they can censor truth, and most people get their information from the internet. But back then, people were gathering together. People were gathering kind of like we just saw with Helene, where they were saying something's wrong here. The mainstream media isn't reporting on this correctly. There's more people dead than they're telling us. FEMA isn't giving us assistance. They're rounding people up and, in fact, preventing people from coming in and helping civilians in need. So the reason I showed you Hurricane Hunters and even mentioning Project Cyrus, which is one of many weather modification projects the government has used, is because clearly this is them destabilizing Cuba. Now, people have to have this impression of Cuba. Cuba's a third world country. Cuba is a wreck. It doesn't matter, whatever your perception of it is. They can turn any country into Cuba overnight because they have control over the power grids, and they can manipulate and modify the weather so that you can't blame it on your own government.